Welcome back to Talking Europe. Well, we were looking there at the future EU-US relations with the new American president, and we're going to discuss that a little more now and also look at some other issues like Turkish-EU relations, the problem with Poland and the current situation in France as it marks the one-year anniversary of terror attacks that left 130 people dead and hundreds more injured on the 13th of November last year. To give us his insight on all of that, we are joined by one of the European Parliament's vice presidents, the leader of France's centre-right in the EU Parliament, Mr. Alain Lamassoure. Mr. Lamassoure, thanks so much for your time. Firstly, very difficult to avoid those election results in the United States. He's trumped it. Donald Trump will be the next president of the White House. How do you see that for the European Union? Good or bad thing?
Unfortunately, it's bad news. First, for the United States of America, for Europe and for the world in general. But it's a decision democratically taken by the American people, so we will have to do with it. Of course, it's too soon to imagine what the foreign policy of Mr. Donald Trump could be, because during his campaign, he spoke very little of foreign issues. He's not aware at all, he's not knowledgeable at all on these issues, and we must not attach too great importance to what he has said so far. But which is more likely is that the withdrawal from the USA, from Europe, the European problem, the European entanglements, the European difficulties, which was initiated by Barack Obama during his both mandates, will continue and possibly reinforce.
When you look there, you mention various topics like security. There's a lot of fears, if you like, here in the EU that Washington will, and notably Donald Trump, will make alliances with Russia's Vladimir Putin. Where will that leave the EU? And do you think that that close relationship will be formed?
It's too early to say. And on such an issue, he can change his positions overnight. But clearly, what is clear is that to fight terrorism, to deter Mr. Putin from going further on some expression of nationalism in Ukraine or in the Caucasus or elsewhere, it's now up to the Europeans to take on their responsibilities.
Well, let's look at those, because one thing Trump will not be helping the EU with is the migration crisis. You know, he's been very clear about that. When we look at the EU, it's still struggling, years into this migration crisis. The one deal it's made is with Turkey. However, we've seen a lot of alarming things happen, if you like, in Turkey. And in some respects, it looks like the EU is almost willing to turn a blind eye to questions of freedom of expression in Turkey or basic human rights in the goal of keeping this deal running.
I don't think so. There have been some strong statements made by our foreign ministers, by President Tusk, by President Juncker very recently towards Turkey and to warn the Turkish president that if he continues like that, of course, Turkey's membership of the EU will be completely dropped. And the other relations between Turkey and EU could be deteriorated. What worries me about migration is no longer Syria, because I am convinced that this agreement with Turkey will last. But my concern is that in the longer term, the main threat of migrations towards the EU will come from Africa. And on this migration flux, we have no answer so far.
I'm going to ask you a question, Mr. Lamassoure, about that flow of migrants from the African coast in just a few minutes. But first, let's take a quick look this week in Turkey. A Franco-Turkish journalist went on trial, accused by the government of terrorist propaganda. Erol Önderoglu was arrested in June after campaigning in solidarity with a Kurdish newspaper. Turkish authorities have stepped up their crackdown in recent months on freedom of speech, notably after a failed coup attempt in July. Yuka Royer brings us this report.
For 20 years, he worked tirelessly to defend journalists. Now he faces up to 15 years in prison. Erol Önderoglu, the Turkish representative of Reporters Without Borders, was arrested in June, accused of terrorist propaganda over his support for a pro-Kurdish newspaper. Released 10 days later, he continued denouncing Ankara's deepening media crackdown.
It's an operation which targets pluralism in the media. It can also potentially weaken all types of political opposition. It's an extremely serious problem for freedom of expression in Turkey.
Önderoglu is being tried on the basis of 3 articles published by Özgür Gündem newspaper about the power struggles within Turkish security forces and about the ongoing operations against Kurdish rebels in the southeast. The journalist's arrest in June sparked an outcry against President Recep Tayyip Erdogan's increasing attempts to silence the media in the name of countering terrorism.
Önderoglu has been criticizing, denouncing and fighting against abuse of Turkey's anti-terrorism law. Today he's fallen victim. He's been put in prison in the name of this absurd law.
Since the failed coup attempt in July, the Turkish authorities have shut down a number of opposition newspapers, including Özgür Gündem, especially in the Kurdish-majority southeast. In late October, the editor-in-chief and a dozen writers at the largest opposition paper, Cumhuriyet, were arrested. Ankara accuses these papers of links with exiled cleric Fethullah Gulen and the PKK Kurdish Workers' Party, seen by the government as the instigators of the botched coup.
So there, Mr. Lamassoure, some of the concerns really from the international community about what's happening in Turkey. EU trying, you're saying, to put pressure on Turkey to toe the line. Turkey also trying to put pressure on the EU, saying that if it doesn't have visa liberalisation by the end of the year, I believe, it's going to pull out of this Turkish-EU migration deal. Will that be an ultimatum the EU will listen to?
No, of course. On human rights in Turkey, the organization which is or should be in front line is the Council of Europe, which Turkey is a member of. And normally the Council of Europe should decide and implement sanctions against Turkey. It's the first stage, then we will see.
OK. Now, you mentioned there for you the main threat to the EU this year or in the years to come is from the African continent.
Yes, exactly.
We saw this week a bit of a U-turn, or at least what appears to be a U-turn on Germany on behalf of the migrants. Their interior minister is saying that wanted to pick people up in the Mediterranean, bring them back to third countries in Africa, like Egypt and Tunisia, and get them to apply for asylum from there. Do you think that's part of the solution?
It could be, but under a lot of conditions. First, it should be a European policy and not a German policy. That's clear. So we need unanimity. Second, we will have to find countries, third countries, who agree on this solution. And if there is a few thousand people, why not? If it's a few 100,000 or millions, it will be completely different. Third, we must ensure that we are able, in these hotspots in third countries, to guarantee to asylum seekers the same rights as if they were on European territory, which means that in these hotspots, the applications of asylum seekers should be managed not by Libyan or Egyptian or Turks civil servants, but by European.
Okay, well, you say again it has to be an EU decision as well, and this seems to be something that the EU increasingly grapples with, having a united front, and even having a power to rule in relation to its own member states. I mean, 3 months ago, Poland was given a deadline saying to stop interfering with one of the highest courts in the land. That deadline has passed. Poland hasn't changed anything. What can the EU do now? I mean, will there be sanctions? Will there be, a suspension of the vote of Poland? Will there be any reaction from the EU?
We cannot go as far as suspension of the vote, implementation of Article 7 of the treaty, because it requires unanimity. And we know that, for instance, Hungary would collide would support Poland. So we cannot put up with such a behavior from a European government in country member of the European Union, but we must be very careful not to interfere too much into internal issues, because we run the risk of bringing together all the Polish population behind their current leaders by a kind of nationalist or patriotic reaction. We must feel the right balance between acting, taking position, reminding everybody of our common values and the treaties, and avoiding to attack one people beyond the government.
Okay, well, a balance still to be found there on that question.
Yeah.
Now, we did also see the Ethics Committee, which had launched an inquiry into the job that José Manuel Barroso took at Goldman Sachs. They had led that inquiry and this week cleared him of any wrongdoing, that former commissioner, head of the commission, taking that job. How do you react to that?
Well, I can see how their reaction could have been different. That's clear. But Jean-Claude Juncker reacted well when the lesson he drew from this case was that the ethic regulation of the Commission, and probably also of other positions in the European Union, had to be changed and reinforced. That's clear. What is more debatable or difficult is the case of Mrs. Nelly Kroes. If it is proved that she lied to us, she lied as a commissioner, because there are allegations against them whereby, while she was commissioner, she had personal financial interests in an offshore company, and it's it's a breach
it doesn't give people confidence
of
in the EU.
the ethic code and even of the treaty, because Article 245 of the treaty obliged the members of the Commission to ethic.
It seems to be an overlap on her case. Now, Barroso did say that he felt the EU's position on his job at Goldman Sachs was just an example of EU hostility to the US, and he said that the EU needs to change its mentality and catch up on that.
He made a huge mistake of judgment, and in his place, I would say silent on the subject.
Now, we've seen, notably in those very recent American elections, nationalism, protectionism clearly on the increase, and not just in the US, also here in the EU. Also, when it comes to the economy, I mean, Trump won on a very isolationist, protectionist platform. Here in the EU, we've seen the same. This recent deal with Canada, the CETA deal, it only barely scraped the first validation round, if you like, and now we're hearing the Netherlands is preparing a referendum potentially on it, the Dutch people, in order to scupper it. Totally not there yet, and it seems that even from the EU side, there's that more closing in.
Yeah. I have two worries on this issue. First, in all our countries, there is now a discourse of hatred with the rise of extremist parties, but also a contagion on this kind of discourse of hatred in the main political parties. It has been the case during the Brexit campaign. It won, hatred won, and now it's the case in the US. And it's the case in many member states. Second worry is the fact that facing nationalism, these temptations you referred to, the response of the European institutions is very weak. For instance, if you take the trade agreement with Canada, CETA, in spite of being legally a European agreement, politically it was a mixed agreement requiring ratification by the 28 member states.
So he basically gave power away from
Parliament.
Brussels
Exactly.
to the national government.
And without reaction of the European Parliament. So implicitly, the European Parliament has judged that he is less legitimate than national parliaments, even in a matter of full competence of the EU, whenever there is a public emotion somewhere. It's a mortal sin.
So a big mistake then on the part of EU institutions. I believe, though, you might be candidate for the next president of the European Parliament. Would that be top of your to-do list to bring more power back to Brussels? Does the job appeal?
It's too soon to declare my candidacy. I am now consulting. It's a possibility. But clearly, it was a case of bad functioning of the European Union and of the European Parliament, because it's a kind of political suicide.
And very, very finally, Mr. Lamassoure, this weekend we're commemorating a sad anniversary for France. It's a year since those November 13 attacks. How do you feel France is now, a year on, in terms of security, in terms of even its morale?
Of course, it's a major concern. Last year, we appreciated a lot all of the solidarity expressed by the entire world, but particularly our partners, European partners, starting in this Parliament. And all the French realized that now is the time to tackle these security issues, these terrorist issues, this common threat together, clearly.
So more work clearly on that to be done. It'll be an ongoing problem, I imagine. But we're out of time in the show. I'd like to thank you, Mr. Lamassoure, for taking time out to talk to us here on France 24. Thanks also, of course, to you at home for having watched. That brings us to the end of this edition of Talking Europe.